next one is not pictures, but of course.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather tonight is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is, of course, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Nipawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community, Roostertown. It's always fabulous to have an opportunity to collaborate with our friends at the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation, and tonight we are gathered to celebrate somehow yet another fabulous publication from them this year. This one showcasing the incredible work of Henry Kalen, one of Canada's most distinguished architectural photographers. Henry Kalen photographer, seen to my left, features contributions from Alison Gillmor, Serena Keshavjee, and Susan Algie, as well as a reflection on Henry Kalen the Man, written by Catherine Acebo. Sadly, Serena is unable to join us this evening, but we will certainly be focusing on her own contributions to the book. Susan will be out in just a moment to introduce the evening, after which there'll be a presentation from Alison Gillmor. Following that presentation, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. If you're one of those folks located here, please just put up your hand and I'll run over to you with this microphone, which just ensures that those watching at home can hear your questions. And if you are watching at home and have any questions, feel free to just write them into the chat. We'll put them to Alison as time permits. I will apologize in advance for the unsparing gaze of the sun. Rest assured that if you are sitting in a particular place, it will leave you and move along to torment your neighbor momentarily. So thank you for your forbearance. I'll be back at the close of the event to just go over signing details. It will naturally take place at this table to my right. But for now, I have the great pleasure of introducing one of the speakers this evening. Susan Algie is one of the founders of the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation and researches, writes, and curates for the organization. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thanks very much, John, and thank you everyone for actually giving up a non-raining evening to come inside and join us for this book launch. As John mentioned, unfortunately, Serena Keshavjee can't be here tonight. She's in Europe, but Alice and I are very happy to welcome you to the event. I wanted to also recognize the contributions of some of the other people for the book. When we do these books, many people are involved as we do research, gather photographs, etc. And I particularly wanted to thank Maya DeForest, Catherine Acebo, Susan McLennan, who is our wonderful volunteer editor and has been helping us with the last number of publications. And with all of our publications, our exhibits, our merchandise, our website, anything that you've seen that the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation has produced over the last many years, it's all been designed by one talented individual, and that's Robin Shusternik of Burdock's Design. So thanks to all of those collaborators. I think many of you know that we undertake research on buildings and landscapes in Winnipeg and also the people who have designed those buildings. And Henry Kalen's photographs have been invaluable as we undertake our research on buildings of the modernist era. Having the Henry Kalen Fonds at the University of Manitoba Archives is an amazing national resource. It's a resource that's open to anyone in the public to go and have a look at. And it's a place that I've spent a considerable amount of time looking through the photographs. I know it's a little bright, but on the screen and also in the book, you're going to see only a very small selection of the photographs which Henry Kalen took over several decades. In the archives, there are tens of thousands of photographs, and he didn't just photograph in Manitoba. He also photographed projects in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, and a couple in British Columbia, as the architects from here hired him to go out and photograph their projects. As well, he did do color photography, particularly in the latter years, and that led into quite a successful postcard business as the architectural photography kind of diminished a bit. He took on, and so you will find still many Henry Kalen postcards either for sale new or at vintage sales, etc. And again, they give you a wonderful snapshot in time of Winnipeg at those different periods. But from my opinion, when featuring architecture, particularly architecture of the modernist era, black and white photography serves it best. I hope that you will enjoy learning more about Henry Kalen and his wonderful photographs. I think everybody here knows Alison, but Alison Gillmor, who is an art and architecture critic and a cultural writer here in Winnipeg, and she's going to speak a little bit more about Henry, the person, and Henry and his work. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you, as always, to Susan Algie, to the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation, and for everything they do, not just on glamorous nights like this, but all the work they do every day to get the word out about our city's extraordinary built environment, its history, but also its possible futures. And I really want to thank Serena Keshavjee. I mean, I'm glad she's in Europe, but enjoying herself. But she authored one of the essays in the book, and she's been such a champion for modernist architecture. And not only with her work on this book, but she also did so much work with Henry Kalen and with his family for the book and the exhibition Winnipeg Modern, which I'm sure some of you remember. And Henry Kalen's photographs really form the visual basis of that book for the most part, and not just supplying the images of specific landmark buildings, but also just kind of imparting the overall vibe, I would say. So, and thank you to the Kalen family. I know they've been very generous sharing Henry's legacy, generous with time and resources and with their memories. And I also want to thank members of my family who are here tonight, and happy anniversary, Jeffrey. So, I think one of the key things I'm going to repeat a couple of times is that Henry Kalen was so good at this because he was both a professional photographer and a trained architect. And I think that's really the key to understanding the brilliance and the beauty and the importance and the lasting value of his work. So, thanks, John. And he possessed both a photographer's, sensitive eye, but also an architect's deep understanding of how structures work. And he brought both of those sets of skills and knowledge to his images of the built environment. And this extraordinary body of work, as Susan says, more than 10,000 photographic prints, caches of negatives, contact sheets, slides, postcards, related, materials, written materials, available through the University of Manitoba Archives. They stand as this really comprehensive, cohesive record of the development of architectural modernism on the Canadian prairies, with a particular focus on his home city. But just as crucially, I think they also demonstrate his mastery of his chosen medium. And his photographs often find this very complex resonance in the ground between, objective documentation and subjective visual poetry. And I just do want to emphasize again, as like the book is just beautifully, copiously illustrated, but it's still just a fraction of his life's work. So photography, of course, is about looking, and there are several ways of looking at Kalen's work. You can view his photographs as a form of official record. There are many examples of kind of what we'd call institutional modernism in his oeuvre. They're often evoked with that kind of clean-lined rationality that's often associated with the modernist aesthetic. He's supplied the definitive images of so many of our iconic Winnipeg buildings. I think when we think of our city's mid-century architecture, we're often, whether we know it or not, are actually seeing it through Kalen's eyes. So he captured the commercial buildings that transformed Winnipeg's core in the 1960s, the large public projects that embodied that sort of very optimistic, forward-looking centennial moment, Canada's centennial and Manitoba's in 1967 and 1970, such as the Centennial Concert Hall, MTC, later the Winnipeg Art Gallery. He recorded the structures that represented new aspects of middle-class life in the post-war period, such as Winnipeg's new international airport with its promise of glamorous jet travel. You remember when jet travel was glamorous? And the Polo Park shopping mall, which became the forerunner of this kind of car-centered suburban consumerism. And his work catches not just these individual structures, although it captures them brilliantly, but a certain historical moment. So the period from the 1950s to the 70s that saw, rising urban population, rapid technological development, economic expansion, some increased social mobility for some people. And it's not just a period then, it's a kind of a mood that he captures. He's often conveying this kind of idealized picture of that optimistic mid-20th century feeling, channeled through these very crisp, clear images of modernist buildings. He worked closely with leading architects and architectural firms, GBR, Liebling Minchner and Associates, Number 10 Architects, Smith Carter, Gusta Rosa, Etienne Goury. And his astonishing technical ability meant he was able to photograph their buildings in their best light, both literally and figuratively. There's a picture of the Monarch Life building, for example, designed by Smith Carter. And it's this viewpoint that's dramatically close and like extremely low. So your eye is just like travels really rapidly up these incredible articulated verticals toward the sky, So he kind of frames and composes his architectural subjects often so they seem to be moving sort of confidently into and upward into, this kind of fabulous future. So even though there's still photographs, they feel sort of cinematic to me. So as was common in a lot of architectural photography of the time, he often renders space as sort of pared down and pristine and unpopulated. Like there's not a lot of people often. So there's photographs of the interior of the Canadian Wheat Board. And they have a lot of the technological objects that signify sort of modern office work, phone systems and electric typewriters and reel-to-reel computing machines. But you don't see any of the people who actually operate these things. So instead, you really get the office's formal qualities. Like you get the perspectival lines, you get the orthogonals in the ceiling kind of rushing toward this really distant vanishing point. There's another kind of executive, like really swish executive suite that seems almost like a stage set right down to the ashtray, you get that sort of Mad Men, Billy Wilder's The Apartment, those kind of references. So I think, they're often untouched by, clutter and crowds. And they can see like this kind of perfected visual rendering of that modernist dream of newness and change. But obviously the modernist period is a lot more complicated than that, not just because many Canadians were left out of this sort of burst of progress and prosperity. So I think it's important to remember that this view of modernism is in some ways a kind of imaginary history. It doesn't always take into account the much darker shadings of that time. But I think often Kalen gets at that as well. If you look closely, some of his images kind of express a lot of contradiction and complexity. There's a lot of, he does industrial sites, for example, and there's something kind of unsettling in the way he these kind of controlled composition and the very subtle silvery tonalities of black and white, they kind of seem at odds with, the messiness of industrial processes. So they're kind of paradoxical photographs. Like he has pictures of Winnipeg's water treatment aeration tanks that are just fabulous. You know, the inland cement plant has this kind of incredible monumental grandeur. You know, the Simplot chemical factory at night is just, you know, spooky and sort of radiant. There's also photos that have a kind of a little bit, maybe a suggestion of humor. And I should say that one of the real pleasures in working on this project, and I'm sure Susan found the same thing, was that it went beyond the sort of beauty shots that we see a lot of that are in the books and the magazines, and you get these interesting photographs where you know, they were probably casual shots when he was like working something through or playing around with an idea. And so you can really see his working process, and it's very interesting. There's one shot, for example, that shows a distant view of Executive House, which, you know, fabulous building, you know, just it embodies the kind of modernism, right? And modern living. And then, but in the foreground, much closer to us, there's the mock Tudor timbers of like an older crescent wood house, right? And of course, you know, like fake Tudor non-structural half beams are like the exact opposite of modernism, right? So I think it's sort of like a visual gag almost, you know, a reminder that you can have these incredible modernist projects, but they're part of this, you know, that they're not in magnificent isolation. They're part of this fabric of an older, varied cityscape, right? So I think he often balances fidelity to the subject with his own explorations as an artist. He sometimes experiments with moody lighting and kind of unexpected angles, either very high or very low. Sometimes odd, idiosyncratic details. The rendering of the Balmoral Motor Hotel, which I think you might have seen. Almost, again, I get these cinematic references, maybe it's my day job, but it almost looks like a film noir still, you know, like you expect Robert Mitchum to walk out of the door smoking. So he, you know, he shoots it at night and you get these deep pools of darkness and then the dramatic uplighting and all those great cars, you know, and the vibe is very nocturnal, very sexy. And he often sort of manipulates expectations by playing around with scale, experimenting with dramatic composition, exploring like dark contrasts, very poetic use of shadow often. So I think he's going beyond sort of the basic recording of, you know, someone else's vision, the architect's vision, to also asserting his own photographic vision. And I think that, again, this is really the key, because he's a trained architect and a practiced photographer. So I think he's really attuned to the challenges of mapping a large, sometimes really large, three-dimensional structure onto a like small two-dimensional surface, right? It can be technically very tricky. And I think he's also very good at navigating this somewhat fraught relationship between architecture and photography, because it's been a complicated kind of relationship over the decades. So he walks this very supple line. He responds to the specific qualities, I think, of his architectural subjects. He respects the buildings, but he pushes the technical capabilities, the expressive potential of the photographic medium. And I think that's partly, you know, it's a balancing act, and it's one that was made possible by his life, his education, his interests, and above all, I think his passion. So Henry Kalen, and I wish Serena was here because I never had the privilege of meeting Henry Kalen, and Serena, I know, knew him well. She worked with him and his family, and she would have been able to tell you much more about him as a man. So I'm going to just give some biographical highlights, and these are just highlights. I mean, if I did everything, we'd be here the whole night. So he was born in the north end of Winnipeg in 1928. He received his architecture degree from the University of Manitoba in 1957. He worked as an architect. He received his accreditation from the Manitoba Association of Architects. But he found himself drawn back to his love of photography, which had been evident even during his architectural education. And the architect Les Stechison, who's here tonight, was a U of M student at the same time as Henry Kalen, and he said that he never used drawings for his presentations. He liked to use photography. And in 1960, he attended a summer session in art education at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, came back to Winnipeg, joined the U of M faculty of architecture, and taught design fundamentals, graphic presentation, and photography until 1971. So at the same time, he's working with architects and firms across the West to document their projects. He's supplying images for Canadian publications like Maclean's, Chatelaine Magazine, Canadian Geographic, as well as developing his postcards. He was a member of the Professional Photographers of Manitoba, the Professional Photographers of Canada and America, received numerous awards, provincially, nationally, internationally. He published 2 books, Henry Kalen's Winnipeg and Henry Kalen's Manitoba, and any McNally employee will be able to tell you they are perennial bestsellers. So just to conclude, I think, again, his dual status as both an architect and a photographer puts him in this very interesting position within the larger history of architectural photography. So the connections between architecture and photography actually go back to the birth of the photographic medium. Louis Daguerre, a 19th century photographer, pioneer really, who developed the daguerreotype process in France, he actually apprenticed as an architect. And over the decades of this partnership, there's been a kind of shifting power dynamics and changing notions about what the proper relationship between these two disciplines should be. So photography was originally seen kind of as an obedient handmaiden to architecture. It was supposed to just replicate buildings with what was seen as rigorous scientific accuracy. And this was partly, they would be published in these sort of photographic series, and they were often used as resources for architects who were working in 19th century revival styles. So the buildings would be photographed straight on in even light so that, budding architects could see the ribbon pilasters and the Corinthian capitals and all that, all those details. As we move into the 20th century, photography is increasingly viewed as an autonomous discipline and an artistic discipline. And so the photographers are putting forward their own claims to artistic status, artistic vision. And some architects and critics really welcomed photography's, assertion of its own aesthetic, its own imperative. In 1934, the British architectural critic Philip Morton Shand said that without modern photography, architecture could never have been put across, he said, to the general public. But then other architects were a little worried. They were worried that photography was going to get the last word on their buildings, I think, and that it would inevitably emphasize form over function and privilege the aesthetic aspects of architecture over its larger social dimensions. So architect and theorist Kenneth Frampton, writing in 1986, said the flattened out flash of photography's sort of visual spectacle would overwhelm the lived physical realities of actual buildings. He said, this is the strange general tendency of our times, the trend to stress information at the expense of experience. But I think, we can see architectural photography as this often really productive, sometimes uneasy collaboration between architects and photographers. And I think in the 21st century, I think we need to bring in one more constituency, the architect, the photographer, but also the people looking at the photographs, the audience, because, in a sense, a photo isn't completed until somebody looks at it, right? Somebody sees it. And I think that's the final way to look at Henry Kalen's photographs, is to ask what they mean to us today in 2024. They're very much of their time, but they take, I think, on like added levels of meaning in the decades since they were created. So he leaves this comprehensive record of the modernist planning and building that was confidently ascendant when the shots were taken. And the originality, the power, the sheer visual style of Kalen's images have also reinforced that era's modernist mythos of, optimism, ambition, transformation. But I think we can see also, we can recognize in hindsight that, not all of those projects worked as the architects intended or hoped. Many of these structures have since been knocked down, sadly, including the International Airport, the public safety building. Many have faded into disrepair and decay, or perhaps even worse, been subject to ill-advised updates and renovations. And I think from the vantage point of 2024, we realize that these buildings, these modernist buildings are a crucial part of Winnipeg's social history, our built environment, but they didn't necessarily change the city and its citizens in the way modernist proponents imagined they could. So they're a layer among many layers of the deep, flawed fabric of our town. But they are incredibly beautiful images, and I think the passage of years has added a kind of poignance to that beauty. I think Henry Kalen's extraordinary visual rendering of this city's modernist moment is now, it's kind of simultaneously a glimpse of a future that never quite came about, and also a memory of that past, and an evocation of possibility, and also a kind of expression of what we've lost in some ways. So, thank you. There's John. Okay.
Hello.
Oh, I just saw this last week in person. It was so amazing. There's often people standing in front of it. It's the Centennial Concert Hall, but wow, it's incredible.
So does anyone here have any questions about it? Yes.
So you or Susan may not be able to answer this, but it's a question about the Henry Kalen farm at U of M. Is there documentation there for who he was commissioned to do particular photographs by, and any working notes of his? Because of course, a photograph is always, as you pointed out, it's made for a purpose with an audience in mind.
Yes. Yes, and a client sometimes in mind. Yeah. Susan you're the person for this, Susan.
Yeah, so fortunately, Henry, and I must mention his wife, Gloria, who played an extremely important role in the firm's operation, kept quite good records. And one of the things that was wonderful is that all of the original project books, handwritten project books, are there. So you can go through and see all of the projects, who they were commissioned for, et cetera, et cetera. As well, you'll find other bits and pieces. Some of the photographs would have a note. In one case it said, "Don't send this to the client, he hasn't paid the bill." So you would find those sorts of things. And as well, as Alison mentioned, for any one image that he was looking to do for, say, the Monarch Life building, he might have taken 40 or 50 images, and you can actually see where he has put the crop marks, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see some of the thinking processes, and also he will have printed the photographs in many different exposures. And so you might come across an image that is quite light, like we saw the image of the Winnipeg Airport in the wintertime. And the image that we have is, I think we might say it's overexposed, but that's the one that made it through. So they do have all of the kind of the side pieces. And as well, if he did work for the magazines, as Alison mentioned, et cetera, he kept copies of those. So there's much, much more exploring for people to do, and to go in and kind of make use of these wonderful archives.
I just wondered if he did his own developing, or did he work for the company? Or how did that, did his own? Okay. That, he must have had quite a lot of units in photographic equipment and facilities then to work with.
I worked for him for several years, 4 or 5 years in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, wow.
He had a fantastic darkroom person, actually. His name was Stanley Palmer, and I'm sorry you can't see the quality of these prints. They were extremely contrasty black and white, which the sun is washing out now.
Yeah.
But Stanley Palmer was always the one who printed the ones for competition. Most of the commissions, like the ones in the book, were done for commissions by the architects. And again, there are striking pictures that I wanted to mention that display another side of Henry Kalen, which were the pictures he took for sheer enjoyment. He recorded every detail in the old city hall, every detail. He clambered up to all the attics and outside on the roofs. He took the photography class that I was in into the dome of the legislative building so we could take photographs up there. He took pictures that were prize-winning photographs of prize-winning industrial objects like pipes, and he lit them in glorious neon colors. So again, I'm sorry you can't see the colors of some of his wonderful, wonderful pieces. And if you would like to see a picture of Henry with the businesses where we were located on Broadway Avenue, it's located in a heritage house right beside the clinic. It's a beautiful old house, and there were about 4 or 5 businesses in it. So Henry's in the middle on the top step, and I'm just below.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned this because I had these photographs, but they were not identified in any way as to who or where.
There was
So
2 graphic
great.
designers, there was an interior design company. Some of you may know Jack McDonald and Bernie Mikuleski. This is Jack and this is Bernie Mikuleski. And it was a wonderful building to work in.
Well, just stepping back to our previous book launch, the Royal Manitoba Theatre Center, the 2 graphic designers you mentioned designed a neon flag on the theater. So, ooh, little circle. Well, thank you so much. Do you mind saying your name?
No, it's Elizabeth Wenzel. I was Elizabeth Friesen at that time when I worked for Henry. And he took pictures of like the model who was wearing the go-go boots. He loved taking pictures of girls in short skirts. So I was posing beside a John Deere tractor with my husband in a short skirt to hand him a lunch bag. He had a good sense of humor.
Well, certainly in the collection, we just used the architectural pieces,
Yes,
but as you mentioned, also in the personal photographs that the family shared with us, it was quite obvious he had quite a sense of humor. He was always doing sort of goofy things in the photographs, along with his wife Gloria, and it was quite delightful to kind of learn a little bit of that side too. Well, thank you so much for that.
And were there any? Yes.
I'm the one that went to school with Henry from 52 to 57. And at that time, of course, that was before computers. Everything was hand drawn. And our main projects were done in design studios all through the years. And we were given very specific instructions on how to present them. It had to be pen and ink on science illustration board. What to show, elevations, plans, site plan, and then overall perspective. And then they were specified to be painted, usually in watercolor. Henry, of course, was never hardly around. I realized he was in his dark room. He used to present, again, these boards were presented on walls. Everybody just seemed to be judged. And his computer, they were like computer drawings you see today. They were just unbelievable. The some of the other young people in the class who weren't quite that good at what they were doing, they were very annoyed with him because he used to get away with presentations that were called for. So he was always kind of, he was kind of suspect by a certain part of the class, but they were amazing, just amazing drawings. And he used to always, for some reason, be late for the handout. He always had excuses, and often they related to a death in the family. By the end of our course, he was only surviving member of the family. But he was wonderful to work with. The most exciting thing I ever had with experience I had was in photographs. We did with rabbits at town center, and we wanted to get a photograph for presentations. He wanted us to hire a helicopter. So I was thinking in this bubble, if you look up the air, the 2,000 people past the bubble just expected to fall to the ground. And he was flying around, he was trying to photograph all the, it was just amazing. But, he was a wonderful person. Yeah. The other thing was what he mentioned about people. We were always lining a person in a photograph. He gave a sense of scale. How big the building is. He gives that sense of scale. He was always reluctant he would wait until everything was on a part view. He let him sit by himself. And it got to be kind of frustrating after a while.
And are there any other questions?
Yeah, just one more question. Does his material with him include any of his equipment?
Not that Susan's aware.
Not that Susan is aware of. If there are no further questions, are there any closing comments either of you would like to make?
Thank you so much for coming and sharing. Thank you.
So we will be moving along to the signing portion of this evening. So in just a moment, Alison and Susan will take their place just behind that table over there. Please do feel free to go up and get a book signed before you pay for it. Just please pay for the book. We are so incredibly grateful to the Winnipeg Architecture Foundation for continuing to publish such incredible works of quality that document our city and just offer entirely new views of the built environment around us and celebrate the incredible legacy of true artists from the city like Henry Kalen as well. So thank you so much to Susan and all of the WAF. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in giving one more warm round of applause to Susan Algie and Alison Gillmor.
I like that contrast. It's better in the book.
Yes, I do apologize for the sun and the poor quality.
I don't think you have to apologize for the sun. That's taking a lot.